Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to replace the fuel injectors on a 2006 and up Honda S2000. I'm replacing my fuel injectors because I'm going to get them sent out to be cleaned, but people often replace fuel injectors when they're trying to narrow down the cause of a misfire. Anyway, let's get to it. The first thing you want to do is relieve the fuel system of any pressure. If you don't do this, you could spray fuel all over yourself when you go to remove the fuel line. The easiest way to do this is to go underneath the dash and pull the fuel pump fuse. The fuel pump fuse should be the 15 amp fuse, which is second from the bottom on the left column. After pulling the fuel pump fuse, use the starter to crank the engine over for a few seconds and release pressure from the fuel system. If you've done this right, your car should not start since it's not getting any fuel. Use a set of pliers to remove the two hose clamps holding the PCV hose to the valve cover and the intake manifold. Pull the PCV hose off of the valve cover and the intake manifold. If you're having trouble getting the hose off, be sure to twist and pull at the same time. With the PCV hose out of the way, you can now remove the fuel rail cover. You should just be able to pull the fuel rail cover right off. Now you'll want to unplug the injector wiring harness connectors from the injectors. Release any plastic clips holding the wiring harness to the fuel rail and pull it away from the fuel rail. Then simply squeeze and lift each injector wiring harness connector to disconnect it from each injector. Before unbolting the fuel rail from the intake manifold, you'll want to disconnect the fuel line from the fuel rail. What is really nice about the 06 and up S2000s is that they have a quick disconnect fitting. Gas will spill out of the fuel line, so insert a rag underneath the fuel line. Then pop the plastic cover off of the quick disconnect. Lastly, pinch the quick disconnect while pulling on the fuel line to separate the two. Now you can unbolt the fuel rail from the intake manifold. Use a 10mm socket to remove the two nuts and two bolts securing the fuel rail to the intake manifold. Once the nuts and bolts are removed, lift the fuel rail off of the intake manifold. Once the fuel rail is separated, place a rag on the fuel hardline to catch any remaining gas that may leak from the fuel rail and place it on a workbench. Use a flathead screwdriver to pry the retaining clips off of the injectors. Then simply pull and wiggle the injectors until they come out of the fuel rail. Now that you've successfully removed your fuel injectors, you'll need to prepare your new or used injectors for installation. If you're installing used injectors, you may want to replace the rubber O-rings that sit at the top and bottom of the injector. If the O-rings are damaged in any way, they will cause a fuel leak where the fuel rail meets the injector. Regardless of whether you replace the O-rings or not, you'll want to lubricate the rubber O-rings with engine oil before installing them onto the fuel rail and the intake manifold. Insert the lubricated injectors into the fuel rail. There will be an alignment tab that will only allow them to be fitted in one direction. Once the injectors are inserted into the fuel rail, reinstall the retaining clips onto the injectors. Align the fuel rail with the mounting points on the intake manifold and pop it into place. Use a 10mm socket to reinstall the two nuts and bolts, securing the fuel rail to the intake manifold. Torque these nuts and bolts to 8.7 foot-pounds. Reconnect the fuel line to the fuel rail. The quick disconnect connector should click once it's been properly reconnected. Afterwards, reinstall the plastic cover. Now reinstall the injector wiring harness connectors onto the injectors and the fuel rail. Reinstall the fuel rail cover by simply pressing it into place. Reinstall the PCV hose in between the intake manifold and the valve cover, and then use a set of pliers to reinstall the two hose clamps. Don't forget to reinstall the fuel pump fuse, or else your car won't start. The fuel pump fuse should be the 15 amp fuse, which is second from the bottom on the left column. Before starting the engine, you'll want to repressurize the fuel system. Insert the key in the ignition and turn it to the on position. If you listen carefully, you should hear the fuel pump run for a couple seconds. Do this process a few times. The last thing you'll want to do is start the engine and check the fuel system for any leaks. Start the engine and inspect the area where the injector meets the fuel rail for any leaks. If you do have any leaks, you likely have an issue with the O-rings on the injector. And that is it. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, give this video a thumbs up and smash that subscribe button if you'd like to see more. As always, leave a comment down below for any DIY you'd like to see in the future.